second Saudi state is going to more or less dominate Central Arabia and other parts of Arabia too for most of the 19th century. Lots of people know about the first Saudi state. Okay, this is the Saudi state established by that very important and momentous alliance between the House of Saud and the House of the Sheikh, the Wahhabis. Okay, very famous. Of course, they're going to temporarily take over the Hijaz, which is going to necessitate the Ottomans calling on Muhammad Ali's army, and the Egyptians are going to come in, and it's going to be brutal. That's more of a famous story. And everyone knows the third Saudi state. I'm standing in the third Saudi state. We call it Saudi Arabia. But far fewer people are aware of the second Saudi state. And if they are, they don't know much, if anything, about it. So let's talk about the second Saudi state for a bit. Because the second Saudi state is going to more or less dominate Central Arabia and other parts of Arabia too for most of the 19th century. Okay, so when the first Saudi state fell, of course, hundreds of members of the House of Saud and hundreds of members of the House of the Sheikh are carted off as prisoners to Cairo. Many of them are going to end up elsewhere. And of course, Abdullah ibn Saud ibn Abdulaziz ibn Muhammad ibn Saud, so the last ruler of the first Saudi state, is going to end up in Istanbul, paraded through the streets and then beheaded. But one member of the House of Saud that is able to escape the Egyptians, able to hide out in Arabia and not be captured, Turki ibn Abdallah ibn Muhammad ibn Saud. So Muhammad ibn Saud, the first ruler of the first Saudi state, he has two sons, okay? And all the rulers of the first Saudi state come through his son Abdulaziz. But he has another son, Abdullah. And what we're going to find is that all the rulers of the second Saudi state and the third current Saudi state come through Abdullah. Okay, so Turki comes from Abdullah. Now, consolidating power for Turki could not have been easy, since Muhammad Ali had sent one of his most ruthless generals to the Nejd in 1820. This guy made a habit of killing, razing towns, pillaging, and for 2 years he wreaked havoc in the Nejd. Okay, so in the process, though, he's also building up lots and lots of anti-Egyptian feeling and, ironically, support for Turki. Now, Turki is able to consolidate power around himself and the idea of a Saudi return to power because, well, the Egyptians are so unpopular. You know, if you go into Saudi museums today, they'll say it's because, you know, the Saudi policies had brought peace to Arabia. And that may be true, but it was at least as equally true that the Egyptians were highly unpopular. In any case, Turki was able to take Riyadh, where I am, and make it his capital. And it will be the capital of the second Saudi state, as well as obviously the third Saudi state, Saudi Arabia. So from 1824 on, Riyadh is the capital, or at least the Saudi capital. He takes Riyadh, but just taking Riyadh and environs, that's not the second Saudi state yet. That's a statelet at most. By the next year, though, he's able to take the province south of Riyadh. And by the time of his death in 1834, his assassination, and I'll talk about his assassination in a second, by the time of his death, Turki has reconquered and consolidated Saudi power throughout all the territory that the first Saudi state had controlled, minus the Hijaz. And I understand that that is an important, significant minus the Hijaz. But still, central, eastern parts of southern Arabia, this is still a significant state, definitely significant enough to call the second Saudi state. The second Saudi state had arrived. Well, Turki is assassinated in 1834 by a distant cousin, a rival, ironically a rival that had launched a rebellion before, but Turki had forgiven him. And yet, despite that, his rival assassinates him and briefly takes over Riyadh. But Turki's son Faisal rushes back here, lays siege to the city, and pretty quickly able to oust this usurper. Now, he's helped in the ousting by a powerful house, hailing from Hale to the north, the Rashid family, the House of Rashid. Now, remember the Rashidis. The story of the second Saudi state begins as a story of the Saudis, but ends as a story of the Rashidis. Faisal may not have ousted this usurper without Rashidi help. In fact, it was a Rashidi who actually physically captured the usurper and handed him over to Faisal. Of course, Faisal is going to kill the guy. Well, Faisal's going to rule for a very long time, and he's generally considered the greatest of the second Saudi state rulers. But it's not smooth, especially in the beginning. It's not smooth. That first decade, I mean, he's already dealt with a usurper. He refuses to acknowledge Ottoman/Egyptian suzerainty over the area. Okay, and so for this, the Egyptians are going to send in another army to pacify the Nejd and to humble the House of Saud. And there's a lot of back and forth, but eventually, 1838, Faisal is captured by the Egyptians, and he's carted off to Cairo as a prisoner for 5 years. Well, after 5 years in Egypt as a prisoner, Faisal able to escape. Events in Egypt help facilitate that escape. He rushes back here, and at that point, the Egyptians have withdrawn their military support for their puppet here, and he's able to pretty easily win back the throne. Once again, though, with the help, possibly critical help, of the House of Rashid. Well, Faisal ruled until 1865, and his reign was mostly stable in the second half, at least. First half very bloody and unstable, obviously. Second half relatively stable and prosperous. Now, there are going to be territories that take decades still to pacify being a euphemism, obviously, and there's going to be at one point an invasion by the Hashemites, by the Sharif of Mecca in the 1840s, that will have to be repulsed. But for the most part, prosperous, stable, successful. And of course, the whole time, the House of Saud in league and supported by the House of the Sheikh. You have Wahhabi scholars and Qadis installed everywhere, enforcing their religious system, but also legitimizing the House of Saud, legitimizing their conquest, legitimizing their taxation, and ginning up the support of warriors when needed to fight under the Saudi banner. So 1865, the year Faisal dies, also the year that relative stability ends, because Faisal is going to be succeeded in turn by several of his sons whose squabbles will dominate Saudi politics for many, many years, right to the end of the second Saudi state. Well, the problem with succession squabbles, especially if they last a long time, is, of course, they open the possibility for rivals to take advantage and take over, oust the ruling family. And that's what's going to happen in a drawn-out process here at the end of the second Saudi state. After Faisal's 1865 death, the throne, in fact, the next 11 years, there are 8 throne changes in just the next 11 years, and then more after that. Faisal's sons, Abdullah, Muhammad, Saud, and then eventually Abdul Rahman, all of them in turn, and some of them multiple times, take over the Saudi throne. And of course, in order to do that, they often have to build alliances they never would have chosen before, alliances with the Rashidis, alliances with the British, alliances with the Ottomans. At one point, the Ottomans are called in to help by one of the claimants, and the Ottomans use it as an excuse to take much of Eastern Arabia, and they try and take Riyadh even. And all the while, the House of Rashid is growing in power. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, the House of Saud is hemorrhaging confidence, hemorrhaging supporters, hemorrhaging territory. In fact, by the mid-1880s, its territory has essentially been shrunken down to Riyadh and area right around Riyadh. So we're back to a statelet. Okay, and all that time, it's the House of Rashid that is ascendant. And by the end of the 1880s, it's the Rashidis who control even Riyadh. I mean, the Saudi ruler of the moment, Abdul Rahman, he is essentially a Rashidi puppet by the end of the 1880s. Now, he doesn't like that. And so at that time, the end of the decade, he launches a rebellion against the House of Rashid. There's several years of fighting. It culminates in a great battle at Mulaida, but the Battle of Mulaida ends up being a decisive Rashidi victory. And the second Saudi state is no more. Now, I should note that one of the Saudi youth present to be ejected in the 1890s from Riyadh by the Rashidis is a young man who will come to be known to the world later as Ibn Saud, founder of the third Saudi state. But that's another story.